Well, joining me now on the program, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister, Alan Tudge, and the Shadow Parliamentary Secretary for Foreign Affairs, Matt Thistlethwaite. Thank you both very much for joining us. I want to start with this letter that's been co-written by each of the Attorneys General throughout the states and territories, both Labor and Liberal, and they are urging the Federal Attorney General to reverse the cuts to legal services that were made in last year's budget and guarantee that no further cuts will be made. They've warned of a looming crisis in the legal sector, Alan Tudge. Can you guarantee that there'll be no further cuts?
Well, David, just let me back up one step and explain what has happened. Firstly, we've got an absolute commitment to providing good funding for the frontline legal aid services for vulnerable people. And indeed, we've committed $1.3 billion over the 4 years. The second point I'd make is that the issue which they have raised is that what we're doing is changing the way that the legal service organisations are funded, so that instead of the Commonwealth funding them directly, we will fund them via the state governments. And we're in a process at the moment of working through that, such that there'll be a new funding arrangement start on the 1st of July this year, and we'll announce that in the budget.
But they say that this funding arrangement that you talk of is just not adequate, and they particularly point to some of the vulnerable sectors of the community, and one sector that you're very familiar with, Indigenous affairs. They say that Indigenous Australians and victims of domestic violence, also a hot topic this year and in particular this week, that they are the ones that are going to suffer the most as a result of the cutbacks that were announced last year.
Yeah, well, as I said, David, we're working on a new package to begin on the 1st of July this year, but just let me pick up your point there. Now, legal aid is important in relation to domestic violence issues, but you've really got to be focused on earlier on in the piece. Now, in relation to Indigenous people, for example, where domestic violence is very high, 2/3 of all domestic violence is related to alcohol. So we're determined to address that issue to stop the violence occurring in the first place, rather than having to wait to get towards the police and legal processes.
Matt Thistlethwaite, will Labor reverse the cuts that were made in last year's budget if it wins government?
Well, contrast the approach of Labor this week, David. Bill Shorten announced this week an additional $50 million for frontline legal aid and services specifically related to combating domestic violence in Aboriginal communities. Alan Tudge says that these aren't a cut, but that's exactly what they are, and that's why the Attorneys General of the states and territories have written this letter. They see that frontline services are going to suffer, and when you talk about Aboriginal Australians, 15 times more likely than the rest of the population to be incarcerated, there's a big problem. And cutting frontline services, cutting support for victims of domestic violence being able to seek legal advice and representation when they're before the courts, perhaps in a custody battle with a partner, is going to make the system much unfairer, and that's why these Attorneys General have written this letter.
Can I just pick up on the points
with that funding that that Bill Shorten sort of announced this week? Does that cover the changes that were made last year, and does Labor pledge to make up any other ground if any further cutbacks are made?
Well, what you can guarantee, David, is that Labor will have a much fairer system. We've said that our approach to the budget won't be to attack the most vulnerable in our community, and we demonstrated that this week by the announcement that we made in respect of domestic violence, but also the announcement that we made on multinational profit shifting, ensuring that the most wealthy multinational companies that seek to shift profits overseas pay their fair share of tax right here in Australia. What you can guarantee is that Labor will have a much fairer approach to budgeting.
Alan Tudge, you wanted to respond to that?
I just wanted to pick up on that one point about going back to the Indigenous situation and the high incarceration rates, and it is very high. It's unacceptably high, but The evidence shows, and this has been done by Don Weatherburn at the Bureau of Crime Statistics, that additional legal aid services have very little impact on the overall crime rate and imprisonment rate. What does have an impact is getting control of alcohol, getting people into work, getting people educated. They're the key levers to address the incarceration rate, and that's absolutely where we're focusing our intentions. Of course, we're also putting money into frontline legal services as well, and we'll have a new package come the 1st of July. But let's not believe that we just put more money into legal services and we'll solve the incarceration rate. We've got to actually address the root causes of it.
Well, could I just reply
the
to
other
that,
area
David?
Yeah, sure, sure.
The government's also cut support for tackling alcohol addiction in our community. They cut funding for the alcohol advisory body. They've cut funding for frontline services to reduce the rates of alcohol addiction in our society. And if an Aboriginal person comes before the legal system and they're not represented because there's been a cut to legal aid funding or the community legal service in their community, they're highly more likely to end up being incarcerated as a result of that.
Yeah, well, another area that's in the news today is pensions. The reform that the government has already announced in relation to pensions would see the value of the age pension go from 28% of weekly earnings to 16% of weekly earnings by 2055. That's largely because the government changes link it to inflation, but weekly earnings are going to go up significantly, close to 80% the average income by 2055. Alan Tudge, is that tolerable to have older Australians earning so much less in their pensions than the average weekly earnings?
David, we have an absolute commitment to the pensioners of Australia that we want to provide a pension which is as generous as possible, but which is nevertheless affordable. And under the Labor plan, if you like, debt was going to be rising to Greek levels. And under that situation, it's actually hard to have a pension at all, let alone a very generous one. So our guarantee is this. Our guarantee is at the very least, pensioners will have an increase every March and every September in line with cost of living, and ideally it would be above that. But that's the absolute minimum, and we're open to discussions with the crossbenchers as to what exactly the formula should look like going forward.
So there's a possibility that you may look to de-link the pension from the CPI, from inflation, at some point further down the track. So you can be, as you say, more generous than just keeping up with the cost of living.
Yeah, well, the commitment is to, at the very least, keep up with cost of living. But as Scott Morrison, the Social Services Minister, has flagged today, he's open to having discussions with the crossbenchers as to what solutions they might have to address the overall fiscal disaster left by the Labor Party, but to nevertheless have a generous pension. Of course, we'd be open to suggestions from the Labor Party as well, but I think we'd be waiting a very long time before any were forthcoming.
Matt Thistlethwaite, any suggestions in this area?
Well, David, we'll have a much fairer approach to budgeting. What the government's doing to pensions, reducing the real value of the pension over time, will see more older Australians slip into poverty. And
it's
when
not
Labor
reducing
came
the
to
real
government,
value of the pension, Matt. It's not reducing the real value. Don't scare pensioners.
Yes, you are. Yes, you are. You are reducing the real value of the pension.
The absolute minimum.
And it won't keep pace with average weekly earnings, and pensioners will fall further behind and slip into poverty. When Labor came to government in 2007, we had an historic increase in the pension to ensure that pensioners did keep pace. And what we won't do is we won't attack the most vulnerable in our community. We won't attack pensioners.
But
we'll ask,
Matt Thistlethwaite, Alan Tudge is right, isn't he, in saying that it won't fall below inflation. Therefore, it won't fall in real terms. It will only fall, as you say, in relation to weekly earnings. But weekly earnings are going to be going up substantially.
It's going to
actually, they're below CPI at the moment, weekly earnings. So CPI is the higher figure right now.
It's going to make it more tougher for pensioners. It's going to see pensioners fall further behind when it comes to keeping pace with other Australians. And Labor's approach will be to make the biggest multinational companies pay their fair share. Our approach will be to ensure that the biggest polluters in our economy pay their fair share. We won't attack pensioners, we won't attack students, and we won't attack Medicare like this government is doing.
So this is
the question then is, Matt Thistlethwaite, how are you going to address that projection of $2.6 trillion of debt by 2055? Because you can't sort of increase taxes for the wealthy to claw back all of that money. There has to be a much bigger approach, especially since you still want to spend more on Gonski, on foreign aid, on childcare, on higher education. You don't want to cut the petrol tax, and you are currently opposing some $5 billion worth of cuts, similar to those that you actually proposed in government.
Well, David, if you look at the difference between my EFO figures and the budget, you see that this government wiped out about $11 billion worth of revenue by getting rid of the Minerals Resource Rent Tax and by getting rid of the price on carbon. So there's a way to restore some of the lost revenue to the budget. We've also seen that Labor said we'll take a much fairer approach, and this week we announced a policy about ensuring that multinational companies can't shift profits overseas and that they pay their fair share here in Australia. We've said that we'll have a look at some of the tax concessions that exist on high-end superannuation, people with more than $2 million in their superannuation accounts. And we're reviewing all of our policies at the moment in the lead up to the National Conference of the Labor Party in July. Labor will be in a position to ensure that we're working towards paying off the debt, but we'll do it in a much fairer and more reasonable way that doesn't attack most vulnerable Australians.
I mean, it's interesting,
Alan,
David,
just on the policy that Matt mentioned there, I'll let you respond, but just also on this point, the policy of that attacking multinational tax avoidance, that will bring in $2 billion or such. You've asked for a conversation. You've asked Labor for ideas. They presented an idea this week that avoids or that tackles tax avoidance by multinationals, and the government slammed that idea because you say it'll cost jobs. But every sort of suggestion has a downside. Why dismiss that one so out of hand?
We dismissed the particular proposal which the Labor Party put up because in essence it was going to make, it would lead to job cuts in Australia. Now we've actually put this issue on the table through the G20 process. We've got some plans going forward to address it. But my overall point in relation to what Matt Thistlethwaite has said is that every single measure that he has raised and the Labor Party has raised to get control of the fiscal disaster which they created is a tax increase, effectively. Their only solution to their fiscal disaster are tax increases, when actually the problem has been spending increases. And now for tax increases to match the spending projections which Labor left, you would have to have 50% higher taxes, a 50% increase in all of the taxes today in order to meet those spending increases by 2055. Now, that would create all sorts of problems for our economy. It would be deeply unfair for so many taxpayers, and it would further lead to disincentives for people to work and create wealth in this country. So we've got to get serious on the spending side, and we've not heard one serious proposal from the Labor Party as to how to get control of their spending.
Okay, well, we are out of time on Saturday Agenda. Alan Tudge and Matt Thistlethwaite, always great to have your company and great to have your company at home. Thanks very much for joining us. The news is up next.